Well, hey, all my friends, long time, no pod, right? So normally I say, hey, welcome to the Everyday Missionary Podcast, but now I'm like, hey, do you remember me? I used to exist out there on the interwebs back in the day and have done nothing now for, 5, maybe 6 weeks, something like that. I don't know, man. There's been all kinds of stuff. And so finally, here that we're almost nearing the middle mark of November. I think I did the last one sometime in September. I don't know. It's been a while. But I'm finally getting around to dropping a pod on all of you. And so hopefully I'm still somehow in your feed. This is going to pop back up and you can go like, oh yeah, I remember that guy from back in the day. He used to say some stuff and he said nothing for a while. But now I'm here to say stuff today. Now, let me give you a little bit of lowdown why I've been gone. I think it's been a number of reasons, honestly. So one, I had a new granddaughter that came into our world. So Finnick Lyra Pratt just turned 1 month old yesterday. And so when you have a new baby and they're in the area and you're helping with the other kids and you're helping with the parents and you're doing a lot of stuff, the world's just been busier for that. So that's a blessing that's made us a little bit busy. That was kind of one thing that kind of delayed me doing any kind of podcast. The second thing was, we were nearing the end of the election cycle and we were getting toward the day, so to speak. And there was all kinds of things I thought I could say, but then I wondered, should I say? And then I'm trying to get back to what my heart is in this podcast. And sometimes in your growing older wisdom, at least I think it's wisdom, you realize like, hey man, maybe I just sit it out for a while. Because if you're not sure you should say that, maybe you shouldn't say that. And so there was a certain level of that. So I kind of did that. I actually did do a podcast in between the last one and this one. So this is number 312. Between 11 and 12, there is a 311.5 that's in there, but it's only in my computer and it's never going to see the light of day. And not for any bad reason. Like sometimes I'll do a podcast and then I'll kind of sit on it for a little while and be like, hey, is that what I was meaning to say in that? Is that the best way to say some of those things? And, after kind of thought about it, went back and listened to it. I'm like, yeah, I think I'm going to sit on that one. At some point, it might see the light of day again. There is the possibility of that. But I just thought, I'm not going to release that one right now. I think there was even a couple of things where in there, I'm like, is that what I'm trying to say with that? And I kind of backed out and said, I don't want to do that. So anyway, so that was kind of another thing. I've been involved in some series stuff lately on Sunday mornings that have been a little bit more dense, taking up a little bit more of my time. So there was some of that. And I do think sometimes you just reach those states in life. And I've shared this a little bit in recent months where sometimes you're kind of so spent. I've been spent, but for good reasons lately, not bad reasons. But I think when you're spent, there is that thing of like, and do I even feel like I'm going to say anything cogent or competent when I get behind the microphone? Maybe not. I'll just ramble. And I don't want to waste your time if I'm just going to ramble just to release a thing every week. Yet it's just kind of drivel. And I feel like I have to do it because you got to keep the system going. And so for all of those reasons, and maybe a couple others, I'm just like, man, I'm going to take a unintended break. Every week I kind of go into it with the same attitude. Like I'm going to do it this week. I'm going to do it. And then every week I don't do it. I am excited though. I have this new chair. I forgot I have this feature. I can put the arms up. Oh, that's way better. My old chair, I was always banging my elbows while I do the podcast. Now I'm putting it fancy free. I can fly south with the geese right now, which I'm watching go over through my window here. But anyway, so now I'm in it. I'm doing it. This is episode 312, and I've titled it, it's kind of a question, which is, have we moved one step closer to being a Christian nation, right? In light of everything that's kind of transpired, but are we one step further from being a Christ-like nation, right? So are we one step closer to being a Christian nation, but one step further from being a Christ-like nation? And for me, I say the signs point in that direction. And I'm going to unpack that here in a minute, but I'm going to highlight a couple of things. But before I get into that, a couple of reminders of what this podcast is really about and designed to do. This is not a podcast to people on the disbelieving left. This is not a podcast to people in other religious backgrounds. This is not a podcast to mainstream churches, even ones that we would consider mainstream evangelical. Like, believe it or not, the United Methodist Church would call it that. Like, this isn't a podcast to those groups. This is a podcast to the more conservative evangelical space within Christianity in the American culture. So it's not for Canadians. It's not for Australians, whatever. I'm thinking about a certain demographic when I do the podcast. And in doing that, I think about it from a pastoral perspective. And what I think the job of any kind of pastor is to actually, they're simultaneous things. In one sense, they are to hopefully be inspiring, encouraging, kind of reminding of the goodness of God, the grace of Jesus, the guidance of the Spirit, like reminding of these positive features. That's one thing. Another thing that I think they're meant to do is to confront or highlight or warn of dangers, not so much on the outside of the camp maybe coming in, though there's a place and time for that. But I think there's always the dangers of things inside the camp that the camp don't see as dangers as much. And because of that, it can take on toxic things within the camp. It can take on certain views or attitudes or ways of doing business or talking about things that are distant from Christ-likeness, but are kind of in the religious ethos of the group, right? And so then the job of a pastor is a bit the job of what I would consider to be like an Old Testament prophet, which is not about, hey, here's what's going to happen in the future. The job of the prophet in the Old Testament was to confront the sins of the nation and say, hey, do you guys not realize that when it comes to the poor, you're bad about that? Do you realize when it comes to the foreigner, you're bad about that? Do you realize when it comes to the widow, you're bad about that? Do you realize that you love money more than God? Or don't you notice that? Do you realize that you think you have fidelity to God, but you have fidelity to your national heritage, and God is being thrown out of the process in the midst of that? So if you were to read through Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the book of the 12, we call it the minor prophets in the Protestant ranks, but the book of the 12, which I way prefer that title, which is the Hebrew idea of the minor prophets. If you were to read all of them, that's all they're doing. They're confronting the sins that are internal to the people of God. And I do think that that's also the job of a pastor. And part of what this podcast does is that thing. And I know for some people, they're like, well, that's just discouraging. Can't you be more encouraging? And I actually go, I think for me, anytime we highlight where maybe we could do better or do different or get refined, to me, that isn't a discouragement. That's kind of an encouragement, because I think good coaching isn't just, hey, Johnny, you're doing great. Good coaching is, hey, Johnny, here's where you can clean up your technique more. Hey, Johnny, here's where you can get a better spring on the ball. Hey, Jane, here's a better way you can do a spike at the net, whatever it is. So coaching is one part like inspiration, and then one part trying to bring transformation by highlighting where our techniques could get strengthened or better, or we have something sloppy or unhealthy, and we can fix that. And that's kind of the heart behind this whole thing. So then in light of that, what I'm going to talk about today in the podcast is trying to highlight some of that. And I'm going to confess, so you can know right off the bat, part of that is reflecting on the recent election. And with that, reflecting on oftentimes tone that I saw throughout the process of the whole unfolding cycle, not just in the last like 6 months, but really over the course of the last several years. I've watched increasingly a tone, not simply from politicians, which I expect politicians to do what politicians do. Like that, that's less the thing for me. I think I way more address this from the perspective of people who claim to follow Jesus, kind of how they're going about business as the political machine is going about its business. And do we have a bigger responsibility in the world when the power structures that are doing what they do? Do we have a bigger responsibility in the world that should transcend party allegiance or party affiliation or even political ideology? And should we be something more both discretionary in one sense and also kind of above the fray of the way the fights go on and above the fray from the way that things are leveraged? And even a part of that, I think that we shouldn't be motivated by what we're told to be motivated by, right? So I think as followers of Jesus in this world, we are a part of his process to reclaim all things. So the kingdom, the idea of his kingdom is, hey, here's how we do business that's different than the way the world does business. And so, I always get excited about the Sermon on the Mount because I think it is the most truncated guide of how we're to do it differently than the way the world would do it. So in Jesus's day, the Jews were doing it one way, the Romans were doing it another way. Both were wrong, right? One was kind of more what I would call pagan, where the Jews were more biblical theistic, and Jesus is confronting both. He's highlighting, hey, when they do it right here, that's great. When they do it wrong there, we got to confront it. And I think that's really the job of the follower of Jesus, is to not be encumbered by all of the tug and pull. And we're to be kind of, for no better way of putting it, we're to be bigger than that. And the way we're bigger than that, according to Jesus, is we're smaller than that, we're less than that, we're servants to all, we're the least of these. Like, he just flips the script constantly for us. And that's the way it's to be done. What I've watched for the last few years is this growing comfort within kind of evangelical spaces with people that claim the name of Jesus in the evangelical space to be increasingly mistaking Christianity as being Christ-like. When I go, the Christianity that's getting promoted is sometimes different than the Christ-likeness that I see when I read the Gospels, right? When I dig into the red letters of Jesus and what I see him doing and what I see him modeling, and then what I'm hearing out of a more politicized evangelical church, and people kind of get pulled into that by way of listening to podcasts and talk radio and certain media outlets or whatever, it starts to shape a tone, because again, the ones you're listening to the most are going to shape your perspectives on things, and the tone that they're bringing to it will inform your tone on it, right? And I think that's kind of the danger. And so from that, I'm increasingly seeing not so much just even a Christian nationalism, I'm seeing more of a national Christendom kind of forming up. And I think even that is further from Christ-likeness than anything else. And that's the danger, is you can kind of codify a thing in the name of Christ that looks nothing like Christ. It just sort of figureheads him. Like, oh, this is all about defending the things of Christ. It's defending the Christian faith and a Christian nation. And then it's really just more about national Christendom. And the church has done that historically. There's been times where they've lost Christ-likeness to a culture, especially when they start to get power. And I'm bringing this up right now because if there is ever a time I can think of in the more immediate kind of Christian or American history and political history in America, this is that time where I think if any Christian goes, oh, we're just so persecuted and we're so against the ropes and everybody's so against us, I'm like, bro, you've cornered almost all the markets at this point. It's like you've got the executive branch, you've got the legislature, you've got the judiciary. You're well protected at this point, and you're well empowered at this point. So there's really no room for victimization, which I've always been sad when I hear fellow Christians acting as though we're victims and we're on the verge of losing our religious rights and our free speech and all these things. Because I'm like, man, we are so far from that. And now more than ever, I think there's others that are risking losing their rights, but it's certainly not going to be the Christians, right? And many of the people in these spaces of power, political power, whatever else, will claim the name of Christ. And I'm not questioning anybody's salvation. Again, I do that a lot on the podcast. I talk about the fact that I'm not talking about questioning salvation. I'm pretty generous on that front. Like, you claim Jesus, hey man, I think you're saved. Like, I don't have a problem with that. It doesn't matter who it is, right? Because some people will be like, that Trump isn't a Christian. I'm like, I don't know. He claims to follow Jesus. I can look at behavior and I can look at decisions and I can look at disposition and go like, I don't think that's Christ-like, but I'm not questioning his salvation. That's just not my game, right? But when I look at the current climate and everything else, I go, if Christianity as an institutional thing was ever to feel pretty calm about not having social pressures, now's the time, right? Now's the time. There are states that are literally mandating that our book and our faith be put in classrooms, and at the cost of other books and other faiths that will not be allowed in those classrooms. I mean, again, I'm more of the line of saying, I don't like that. I don't really want that in the public school system, or all of it needs equal representation in the public school system. So when we're going to have classes where you have to learn the Bible, I just feel like that is the First Amendment is shot. But this is part of the problem I'm seeing right now. Why I want to get back to this idea of nationalized Christendom. I do see that there is this push, and I'm hearing it from certain Christian leaders, and I'm hearing it from others who are Christians that are just kind of pundits in the political space. They're increasingly comfortable with saying, the Constitution, maybe we should think about dismantling this, because it does get in the way of trying to enforce a more Christendom model in our culture. That First Amendment is pesky. If we want to really force people to be more Christian, we got to deal with that. And so I have heard people say, maybe it's time to get rid of that. Maybe it's time to move on from it. We really need a more authoritarian way of getting things done. And so they kind of welcome that. All of that, to me, I go back to this idea of saying, and that's not Christ-like. And it's not Christ-like at many levels. You know what I mean? And that's my heart. So my heart isn't so much wanting to make a statement about the incoming administration. Weirdly enough, I had somebody I was talking to recently, and they were like, aren't you really concerned about President Trump? Honestly, I'm not. I'm not. And can I just give you a bonus here? Part of the reason, one of the things I think about, one of the things where I go, this is why I think we're closer to a Christian nation and further from Christ-like one, is what I did watch in the election cycle is the leveraging of a lot of fear to get, in particular, Christians to come out and vote, evangelicals to come out and vote. And yet I see the Bible prescribes for the Christ follower, you're never to be motivated by fear. You're not to fear losing your life. You're not to fear being persecuted. You're not to fear the world around you. And when I saw so many fellow believers talking so much about fear and fearing if the Democrats won, fearing if they lose their free speech, fearing if they lose their right to religious practice, all of these kinds of things, I look at persecution as opportunity for Jesus to be highlighted. And so when I heard so many people being motivated by the fear of this and the fear of this and the fear of this and the fear of the outsiders coming into our country and the fear of diluting our nationality and now all these things, and I remember I would just kind of go like, this is 100% opposite of Christ-likeness, like 100% opposite. As soon as we're talking about our fears of things, we're seeding one of the best ways we can demonstrate our faith, which is we're not fearing these things. And so that's where I'm saying, like, again, the Christ-likeness thing takes these seasons as an opportunity to share, I'm not rattled by this. I'm not freaked out by this. I'm not losing sleep over this. And that's still true for me, right? So I'll have people that were on the other side of this, and they felt like, if Trump comes into power, democracy's gone, the world as we know it is over. They're going to hunt down and deport, or they're going to create internment camps, and they're going to put everybody they don't agree with in internment camps, and they're going to use the United States military against political adversaries if they're just people that hold a different position than Trump. And there's all these fear things. And I'm like, I'm not giving anybody my fear, right? So that's my encouragement to you. You want to be Christ-like. Don't give anybody your fear. I love that of Isaiah chapter 8, where he's like, man, if you just focus on fearing the Lord, you got nothing else to fear. And there, Isaiah is talking about the Babylonians coming after him, right? Like, they actually did get throttled. They did get plundered. They did get pulled into Babylon. And what's the advice? Don't be fearful. Stop fearing, right? And so it's stuff like that where when I look and I go, I think what was motivating a lot of what's happened in recent months was fear. I think a lot of people were fearful and then voted in line with the idea of who's most apt to remove my fears. And for the world that doesn't follow Jesus, that makes perfect sense to me. And that was going to be on both sides. Both sides are going to be like, that person alleviates my fears. But I go back to, as a follower of Jesus, no person should alleviate our fears, right? Like that notion, when 365 times in the Bible it says, don't fear, that's like a mandate, And so that's my first encouragement. Don't fear, right? That's Christ-likeness. The idea of a nationalized Christendom is always motivated by fear. Fear of outsiders, fear of others, fear of a loss of control, fear of immorality reigning, fear of all these other things. And then it uses religion in tandem with politics to lock things down. And that was Europe under the Catholic Church for 1,000 years, Never goes to good places. Never goes to good places. And so that's kind of the first thing. As soon as we're motivated by our earthly fears, we're losing sight of our heavenly commission and calling in this world. And I do think it undermines our ability to be faithful missionaries and a witness to Jesus, because again, we sound like everybody else. Like if we can't deal with fear in a different way and have faith instead of fear, we offer nothing to the world. Like, why would they want our Jesus if we're motivated in the same ways and by the same things as them? Now we're just contending over worldviews that are going to dominate the other side. And I'm hoping my worldview will overpower your worldview, and my politician will overpower your politician, so that your fears are heightened. And that's not my problem, as long as my fears are relieved because my person's in charge. That's not Christ-like at all. It's not Christ-like at all. So that's kind of my first thing, is I want to remind us, if we were motivated by fear, or maybe on the other side of that, if we were motivated by, and this was a funny one to me, when things were going down, this idea of retribution. Super weird that Christians got excited about retribution. Like they wanted it and they were excited about it. And I'm like, this is super weird. We come from a faith background that's literally about God coming and not seeking retribution, but rather when he was harmed, punished, throttled, crucified, he's there like, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. He's given himself away. It's so wild. In fact, just as a little thought experiment to kind of ourselves think, how seriously do I take following Jesus? Because this was the one I did. And I didn't get this. This is an original. I actually was listening to a podcast. It was actually Carl Lentz talking about somebody named Dr. Anita. And I'm not who that is, but she is, I don't know if she's like a pastor or literally a doctor of some kind in therapy or whatever it was. But she used this thought experiment, which is you just walk through the last 24 hours of Jesus' life and overlay your life on there, and then ask yourself, where do you punch out? Like, where do you say, I'm no longer going to be like Jesus in this process? So is it in the upper room when your friends don't understand the foot washing thing? Is it later in the upper room when your friend is betraying you and acting as though he's your friend? Is it in the garden where your friends fall asleep on you and you're left by yourself to tend to things and you're going through the misery of that? Is it when you're arrested and beaten by your own people? Is it when you're, brought before the Roman authorities and what they do there and what the soldiers do to Jesus there? Is it when you're walking on the road to the hill of the skull and they spit on you? Is that where you punch out? Do you punch out when they strip you naked? Like, where do you punch out, right? And it's interesting when I think about this idea of American exceptionalism and kind of fear, if that party gets in control, it's going to take this from me. And again, for other people, I get it, but for Jesus followers, like, we follow a Jesus that went through this whole thing and then tells us to be like him, even uses the cross as the example of our lives and how we should face life too. And yet I go, like, we're not even willing to take the proverbial spit, much less the real deal, right? We're not willing to say, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. We're more apt to call them libtards and try to shut them down and shame them in some way and talk about how big of a threat they are. And, I have nothing good to say of them. And like, it's just so different. And so this is where, again, I go back into when we get really pulled in to an earthly way of thinking, we start to increasingly divorce ourselves from a Christ-like disposition. And we even invert the poles a little bit to where then we take that disposition and say, that's more faithful. Like, that's the more faithful thing. So let me give you an example of this that I was just listening to yesterday. So Mark Driscoll had a video that was the Sunday after the election, so it would have been just this last Sunday. And he gets up there and he's like, man, I feel good, and I feel great because just the election went the way we wanted it to go. And he goes, with all of this, like he goes, when people push on God, we got to push back, right? And I just, like, that idea right there, I kind of stop on a little bit because I'm like, when people push on God, we got to push back. Well, guess what? God came into the world and people pushed on God. And what did God do? Right? He didn't push back. That's the whole notion of what this Jesus experiment is all about, and that we're told to be like him. Right? Jesus pulls the judo move. Like, he goes behind the obvious thing. He doesn't punch him back in the face. He's like giving himself away, and that's the way you win over your enemies. And for hundreds of years, that's how the church did business. You want to know how Rome was transformed in the positive was they just kept being like Jesus. They were Christ-like, right? When the culture was against them, they showed a transcendent faith over fear, love over hate. They didn't want retribution. They wanted restoration for people. And so they lived it and they owned it and they gave everything to it. Blood, sweat, tears, and lives to it, right? I just don't believe in any capacity we're ready to do that today. Like, I almost think we would say, that's dumb, that's foolish, that's naive, that doesn't work. You got to use force, strength, might, power. Here's where that did happen. After Rome was Christianized, right? What happened? It went from being Christ-like to being Christian-esque as a Christian nation to then nationalize Christendom. And now Christianity was monitored through the sword, not through the cross, not through sacrifice, not through service, not through humility, but through power and pride. And this idea of the very thing Rome did to create peace that was negative, right, for like the Jewish population, the church just used the same model eventually and ruled over Europe for a long, long time with that kind of model. And there's different times in different places where that's still true. And frankly, what freaks me out sometimes when I'm listening to Christians right now, they're sort of welcoming that again. Like, the notion of Christian nationalism isn't a small thing. There's a lot of places where whether people call it that or they don't, I think there's a draw to it that says, hey, man, if you have to enforce certain things in the spirit of Christianity for our culture, that's just what you got to do. So the more political clout you have, the more you can mandate certain things in that political clout. And again, I think the place that leads to is Christlessness. It's not more Christ-likeness. It leads to Christlessness. And that's the danger. And so again, going back to this thing with Driscoll, he was talking about these different things. And then he goes, I got pastors coming to me and saying, how can you get away with saying what you say? How can you get away with, like calling things out like you do? In my church, I would get beat up for it and throttled and fired and everything else. And he's like, pastors just have to be courageous. They haven't been courageous. They got to be courageous. And I was listening to that. I'm like, okay, Mark, you're in a conservative evangelical church. Most of the people you're talking about pastorally are in conservative evangelical churches. If we look at the record of evangelicals and how they voted, the giant majority went for President Trump, right? That's just where it went. So this notion that like Mark was being all bold for backing the conservative party, backing President Trump, backing the right, and then calling it bold in his church, I'm like, that's not bold. That's not bold at all, right? That's like, you're giving red meat to the lions and they love it. I'm just like, that's surprising to me that you would consider that bold. Now, if he was in a far left church, that's bold, right? I go, that is a bold thing, right? And if you're calling out the sins of the left in a leftist church, that would be bold, yes. This isn't bold. His social media following has exploded. His church grew immensely. There was nothing bold about it. It's good marketing in some ways, right? What bold is to me is Christ-likeness. And what Christ-likeness, in my opinion, does is it praises when it sees good and it confronts when it sees bad. And it doesn't care in what context it's in because it knows every context usually has something good to bring and something bad to work on. And that's the place of Christ-likeness. And then in that, it's benchmarking, not simply even against, quote, ethics. It's benchmarking against kingdom values. And I separate those out a little bit because I do think what has happened in some of this and what kind of, even for Mark, as I was listening to him over the last couple of years, as he got further and further kind of into the political side of things, not just simply in the pastoral side of things, is that there was a lot more of looking at the sexual sins of society, looking at the transgender debate, looking at the kind of LGBTQ plus debate in a softer way. The trans thing was certainly like a really big one. Certainly Mark has come out against beta males is what he calls them. So men that aren't masculine as he defines masculinity. They're just weak men that, again, kowtow to their wives and they're too soft and they're too kind and they're too meek. And that's kind of problematic. And so there's a lot of this like defining what is this thing. And again, I go, the job of the pastor is to go, again, not, I'm going to hyper define all this stuff and then hold everybody against that. And I'm going to make the ethics of all of this the chief thing. The chief thing is always the kingdom values. The chief thing is what Jesus instructed us to do and what Jesus modeled for us to do. And then when I look at that, I go, that's bold. And that boldness, I'm not seeing so much. I'm seeing a fabricated boldness under a certain criteria, some of which I go, yeah, that's in the Bible. I'm not going to argue that. But even how you're going about it, the tone and all the other additives, those are the things that are then problematic. And I go, this reminds me more of Christendom. This reminds me of a nationalized Christianity. This doesn't remind me of Christ-likeness. And I'm always going to pull everything back to that notion of what is Christ-likeness. And so think about it. What was bold about Jesus? Was Jesus bold because he called out Rome? Well, he almost never did it. Was Jesus bold because he called out religion? Maybe a little bit more, which is kind of, there's a tip-off. It's really funny. Like when I look and I go, it seems like Jesus really called out religion a lot because it could be religious. It could be judgmental. It could be superior. It could be proud. So, so like maybe that's the thing we do consider that needs to be fixed and challenged at times. But I'll tell you what made Jesus really bold and then why he called out religion in light of that. And this is going to be my guiding principle in life, no matter what. What made Jesus bold, what got Jesus canceled, what got Jesus killed, right, was he was hanging out with the riffraff, right? He was giving a sense of dignity and value and worth and want to the unlovelies, the untouchables, the undesireds, the misfits, the brokens, the sinfuls, if you will. And that was bold. Like that was the bold thing. Like Jesus is going to the other, and he doesn't care what religion thinks. He's going to do it anyway. And then when religion pitches its fit, then he scolds them saying, hey man, you all should know better. Like you should know better. I mean, just go back to the book of the 12, you guys. Go back to your minor prophets. They're calling you out for this ridiculousness all the time, and you're just wash, rinse, and repeat again. You're forgetting the very essence of true justness done in love. It's to care about everybody that nobody cares about. And then Jesus shows up, and that's what he's doing, left, right, and center all the time, right? And so then I bring it into our current discussions and debates and divides, and I'm like, I see this notion almost of like, they're illegal, get them out, right? Oh, they have these things going on. They don't understand themselves, and so they're kind of pariahs. We got to figure out how to banish them more. I got to ban them from things, and we got to keep them out. We got to get back to this notion of utopia that isn't utopia for everybody. It's only utopia for the majority, I guess. And we're getting the minority, which is what Jesus came for, as a minority, for the ones that everybody else blew off and forgot or didn't care or didn't love or didn't want. That's what Jesus is there to do. And that's what made Jesus bold. And that's kind of my point, right? I'm tired of this artificial, now you're getting me to rant a little bit, and I'm probably sinning a little bit, so I'll let you know. But I shouldn't say tired of, because that does sound a little too bitey. I do think I'm grieved for sure, and then I probably sinfully go into a righteous anger that I'm just, for the record, I don't buy righteous anger. I just don't. Like, I know the tone, I know the thing. I've never personally experienced it, either coming at me or me expressing it. So I think I just have anger. But what does grieve me deeper inside of this whole thing is there is this thing like, I'm going to say something bold and it's going to get me canceled. And then they say something that just is appealing to their base, right? And they're like, that's right, you're going to get canceled by the left and the woke because they hate this stuff. And I'm like, right, but that person doesn't have a job on the left with the woke, and who cares, right? They know that you're going to prop them up more, and you're going to be like, that's right, you have the courage to say what nobody else will say, and that's bold. And I go, that's not bold. What's bold is what Jesus did. What's bold is he goes and hangs out with the hookers. That's bold, man. And not just hangs out with them, actually says, these are my friends. And not just my friends, but he lets one wash his bare naked feet, right? Like, that's bold. That's bold that he shows her dignity and value, right? That nobody else did. And then when she does it, it's religion that shows up and it's like, oh man, he's so terrible. He's hanging out with this whore. And he's like, wait a minute. She's like, she gets this. Like, she gets it in a way you don't get it, Like, Jesus is hanging out with people that are again, the truly the untouchables, like the tax collectors. It's like, let me get this straight. Like, you're taking our money, our hard-earned money, and you're giving it to our enemies, who then put us under their boot, and they make us fear at the end of a sword if we don't play by your rules. So we're funding our own oppression, and you're one of our own who makes that process possible. Like, you are a traitor, you're a turncoat, you're Benedict Arnold, just in the Jewish version of it. You're all these terrible things, and then Jesus is rolling in like, yeah, those dudes are my friends. Right? And they're like, what are you talking about? You have no patriotism, Jesus. You are not loyal to Israel if you have friendship with them. And he's like, yep, I don't care. Because you know what? That's who Jesus came for. That's who God cares about. That's who he's doing a work in. And that, to me, is bold, right? That's bold. That's the stuff I dig about Jesus. So all this other stuff that people are saying is so bold, and you're willing to say the truth. Oh, man, there's so much market in that. There's so much money to be made in that. I've told my wife many times, I'm like, man, I could have a ginormous church if I just leaned into that rhetoric, man, because I'm seeing it all over the place. Like, that's the thing. And everybody thinks it's bold. And these things keep growing. And that should be the tip off of, like, if it's so bold and so crazy and so unpopular, it should be small, right? It's not small. It's huge, man. It's huge. And so that's one of those ironies to me. People are like, you know what? If everybody's loving it, then you know it ain't right. Well, everybody's loving it, and now it's right. And I'm just like, dude, man, it should be different. It should be different. And this is where I bring it back to Christ-likeness again. Like, that's the thing. And so I'm going to give a challenge to all of us in this, because here's the deal. Like I said, the podcast deals with more evangelicals, conservatives, a little bit more to the right. That's kind of the space that I live in and dwell in. And then my job is to confront the idols of that space. Again, if I was in another space, I would be doing the other thing over there. Like, that's where I think sometimes I get accused of certain things because I'm speaking into my space. And I'm not doing it like some other people are doing it, where a lot of people are speaking into that space and fueling the idols, I think. They're fueling the sins, I think. I think they're even fueling the anger, the division, the superiority. They're fueling animosity. They're fueling kind of a glee even when their social others lose, get caught up in something false, or they fall in some way. There's like they got what they deserve kind of thing. And I'm just like, man, we all be sinners. We should look at this really different, right? And so this to me is really, really important, that the Christ-like thing is important, and his calling and commission to us to be wise and to be non-discretionary toward people, and to be the peacemakers who are sowing peace and then harvesting this idea of righteousness, which righteousness is not moralism. In the Bible, righteousness is about doing right by God and by others. That's righteousness, doing right by God and right by others. And part of the way we do right by God is we do what God tells us to do. And the chief thing he tells us to do is what? Love him and love others. And I believe the way we really show that we love him is that we love others, because it's hard to love the others that don't love us, or it's hard to love the unlovelies. And all the more, I think we prove our loyalty to God and our love to God by loving the unlovelies, the unlovables, the ones that don't love us, maybe the ones that hate us, don't want good for us. We lean into that, and that proves how loyal we are in loving God. But if our mentality is, I love God so much, I want what's bad for them. I love God so much, I'm against them. I love God so much, I'm trying to cordon them off, and I'm trying to see policy and procedures put that shuts them down so I don't have to love them. I'm hoping to get rid of them somehow. That is not Christ-like. That might be nationalistic Christendom, right? Where it's religion with a facade of Christ as a focal head, but nobody is actually trying to demonstrate him or emulate him. It's just like, we do it for Christ, and Christ is a baddie, and he's coming back on a white horse with a sword, and we're getting ahead of him on it, right? Like I think there's that attitude a little bit. And again, I don't think that's the model of Christ-likeness that we are to display, and certainly we are commanded to live. I see what made Jesus bold was maybe two things. One is how he handled the untouchables and the unlovelies and the unwanteds. He really was their friend, right? And he was bold because then his religious adversaries who thought they were better than the riffraff, he confronted them on that. Like, you're missing the boat. You're getting in the way. God's going to deal with that in you one day. You think you have a jurisdiction and a justification to not love these people, and even to judge these people and to mock these people and call them names and see them as a problem, and you just got to figure out how to dismantle or just disregard them somehow. Jesus is like, I'm just warning you, you're going to face God one day for that. That's Matthew 23 when he's like, woe to you and woe to you and woe to you and woe to you. Part of that is like, man, you make getting into the kingdom so damn hard, like you're going to face God for that. And I do think there's some of that. I think there is a tone that makes approaching Christ very hard that's coming from some quadrants out there. And I'm not, be clear, there's so many people at Redemption Church that are rad they get this already. I want to keep kind of turning that flywheel and getting more people to get that, because I think that's really critical right now. I just see so many people that are so turned away by Jesus because of what they're seeing out of some quadrants of this right now. And that's what ails my heart. I'm like, as soon as we're making it hard to get in, hard to even approach, literally like we're building ramparts and gates with razor wire over the top, and like, you either succumb or you're toast to us. That's just not the way of Christ to me, right? That's just not the way of Christ. So what is then the other thing that makes Christ bold to me, aside from he loves the unlovelies, tells religion they're missing it in the process? It's frankly how he dies. That's bold, right? And that's why I use that Dr. Anita thought experiment that I so appreciated. Like, if you're punching out at the left is crazy and I'm just going to make fun of them or mock them or call them names or whatever else, you're punching out the day before the upper room. You're like, I'm never going down the road where I got to risk rejection. And I'm never going down the road where I entertain any time of day with people of that nature. And I'm going to take every chance to think badly of them. You're never getting near the path of a crucified Christ, right? You're just not doing that. And I go back to that 1 Peter chapter 2. It sets up that the way Jesus went to the cross is the model for us to live. Not just the cross itself, the way he went, right? So he doesn't fight, he doesn't resist, he doesn't retaliate, he doesn't call him a bunch of names, he isn't spewing whatever. There is just this display of love from beginning to end, a display of generosity from beginning to end, a display of like they don't even get it, and so like I just pity them from beginning to end. Like that is the healthy space of a Christ-like mentality. So, I just think walking the Viva de la Rosa, so to speak, in your brain, going, okay, so this is the cultural equivalent of getting rejected by my friends. This is the cultural equivalent of being brought up on trial. This is the cultural equivalent of being beat up. This is the cultural equivalent of people spitting on me. This is the cultural equivalent of being stripped naked. And staying in the pocket of love the whole time for the people doing that to you. Just to be clear, that's Christ-likeness. And this is where I go, if you want to have a Christian nation, it needs to look like that. It needs to look Christ-like. And if it's not looking Christ-like, it's not a Christian nation, it's national Christendom. That's a completely different thing. It's just religion and politics merged together and trying to force people to be what you want them to be. And one day that might bite you in the butt because it flips on you, and now you're at the mercy of the very beast you built. It's like that's always going to be the risk. So then how can we, as everyday missionaries then, in light of all of this, do what I'm talking about? And here's the great part. I'm going to be an equal opportunity challenger on this one. Because coming out of the election, I'm experiencing two things simultaneously. Generally, there's mushy in the middle. But generally, I'm getting two things. I'm getting either people that are really, really thrilled about what just happened, or people that are really, really fearful about what just happened, right? Both of those things are in play. And I go, guess what? We didn't just elect a savior, and we also didn't elect the Antichrist. Just for the record, neither one is in office right now, or to be in office here come January 20th. You don't have a savior. You don't have an Antichrist. That's just not what happened. That's not the way this is looked at. If you were really, really fearful and now you're not fearful, you might have some misplaced fear and faith if it's in a person. And on the flip, if you were really hopeful and now you're really fearful, you might have had some misplaced hope and faith in the wrong thing, right? Like, because we as followers of Jesus, we're to orbit above all of this, right? We're in it. We're to contribute to it. We're to speak into it. We're to serve into it. We're to do all those things into it. But we are not to get pulled into all of the emotional undercurrent of it and start to get co-opted to where what is primarily driving us is idolize that, demonize that. That is my functional savior to get me out of this functional hell and into my functional heaven. Like none of that is to be the case in this. We're to do it different. So here's how we can be bold, right? Going forward. Ready? Here's how we can be bold. If you were somebody that was like, Trump is the most destructive force, the most dangerous thing, and he's in power soon to be, and everybody who voted for him empowered that, and you might think that they don't see it, they don't get it, why are they so blind, why whatever. Here's the thing I'm going to call you to do, challenge you to do, is to be like Jesus in all of those conversations with all of those types of people and perceiving this reality that is before you, right? Where you go, okay, in light of who you might think to be a terrible choice for terrible reasons, and you might even feel democracy's at stake, here's what you get to do. You get to be like Jesus. You get to, let's say you treat him as an enemy. You get to do good, pray for, and bless, right? Those people. You get to figure out how you can become friends with those types of people. You need to cross over because they, for you, are the leper, are the prostitute, are the whatever, right? The outcast. And we can either choose to be like religion and be pissed at them and alienate them and stay away from them, or we can be like Jesus and we pursue them. We lean into them. We build relationship with them. We care about them. We love for them. We pray for them. We do good to them. We bless them, right? Like, this is what's so cool about this. Like, it plays both ways, right? So then let me flip it. Let's say you were like super stoked, super excited. Trump's going to be president. Finally, nature's being set right. I read that from Charlie Kirk this week. Like, nature is being set right. Like, that was an idolatrous thing when all of nature is being set right now. And he had a long list of reasons that nature, like, now the birds are going to all migrate perfectly. And no, I was just like, okay, whatever. But if you're on that side, you got a large population of people out there that are fearful right now, fearful of your president to be, fearful of the tone that was set. Because I would say much of the tone that was set was, to me, very un-Christ-like. That was true. I really did feel like a lot of the tone setting was incredibly un-Christ-like, being said by people that claim to follow Christ. And that will always grieve me. Like, I go, man, there was so much un-Christ-like tone and discussion and wording, and just contrary to anything that models the stuff of Jesus. But for you as a follower of Jesus now, it's your job to bring calm to those who are fearful, for you to go to the outsider. So here's what it means for you. Like, here's my challenge. You should get to know a trans person. You should get to know a trans person, their story, why they're so afraid right now, why they're so burdened, and you get to be Jesus to them, right? You should go to that person that is, again, really freaked out by the repercussions of this. And you got to figure out how you can really care about them, love them, and serve them, do good to them. And to realize that your job is their care. And God calls you to love them in that space, and they need your assistance right now to help bring a different vision and view of the way they see things as they are, right? And so for all of us, we have an opportunity now. And for all of us, we have a warning. So the warning is, if we're angry, ranting, fearful, okay, I gotta get centered back on Christ. If we're gleeful, relieved, hopeful, putting too much faith in a person or a system or a party or a power structure, and we need to recalibrate to Christ. And whoever is that other that is untouchable for you, you better go learn how you can touch their life, because that's what Jesus calls us to do. This becomes uncomfortable for all of us. And I think in this, here's what I know about the future. I don't know about the future. I don't know what it holds. Like, I'm hearing a lot of prognosis of how things are going to go down, and he's going to do this and he's going to do that, and there's all this stuff. And I go, man, I don't know. Jesus gives us instruction there. He's like, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will worry about itself. Just worry about today. Today is the thing we all should focus on. So if there is like, he's going to solve the mysteries in the universe, or he's going to destroy democracies, we ain't there yet. We're not there to either one of those things. Like, just it's not. There's going to be a lot of hype. Both sides are going to be doing their different thing. The media on both sides are going to be doing their different thing. And again, we should kind of be outside of all of that to something different. So we worry about today. But then let's say when tomorrow happens, if it's something good, we should say that's good. If it's something bad, we should say that's bad. And here's the thing. Every Christian should do the same thing, right? Like, that's part of the deal. So don't be like, hey, when the other side does it, I'm going to highlight all of their offenses. When my side does it, I'm going to downplay this, man. Like, no, we are to be a respecter of no persons, right? and this is said more than once. Like, don't show favoritism. So I don't want to favor, like, if this side does something that I go, that doesn't honor Christ, or that's destructive, or that's demeaning to other human beings, or that doesn't value the image of God in people. As a Christian, I don't want to be like, well, I excuse that. I go like, no, I grieve that. I pray that would be different. I want to contend to be a voice that challenges something that is unhealthy over there. Like I know for me personally, I go, the Bible speaks a lot about the foreigner and welcoming them and taking care of them. And I know for a lot of people on the right, like, we don't want to welcome them nor take care of them. And I'm like, here's one of those things where I go, I'm a follower of Jesus. I see this as a clear mandate multiple times in Scripture. And therefore, I go, I'll speak into that. I think this is a policy that I don't think is truly Christian, nor do I think it's scriptural. And I want to have my voice there, right? Like, that's a thing to care about, And so speak truth into something where you think there is error, even if it's on your own team. That's authentic Christ-likeness, right? And the same on the flip. If I see the other side of something doing something that I think is good, I should be like, I praise that. That's awesome. That's something that's a scriptural idea. I can support that. Something that they're doing unhealthy or wrong, or something that you want to speak into and feel like we need to be a source of policy change, doing that. But doing all of it peacefully, doing all of it lovingly, doing all of it thoughtfully, doing all of it in that spirit of Christ-likeness. That's what we're meant to do. So as we come out of this whole thing and people are divided, and I'm seeing, especially on social media, like the dread of people on the left And I'm seeing way too much spiking of the ball on the right. And these are people that also would claim to be Christians. I go, we got to get back to Christ likeness. Like, just let that be the compass, right? And again, it's not hard. Just read Mark. I'll give you the shortest gospel. Just read Mark and ditto what you see there. Remember, the boldness isn't to be like, I stand against this and I stand against that, but rather boldness is to stand with people that need it, no matter what your side thinks of it. That's boldness. And boldness is to do it the Jesus way, even though it may not seem to be a very functional or efficient way, or it might even look like a naive way, because I think that's true. The way of Jesus looks very naive. That was also one of the things I saw a lot of, is I think, as I watched kind of the fear develop, then the solution to the fear was not terribly Christ-like. The solution to the fear was incredibly earthly. And therefore, what that does then is it starts to amalgamize, which I think I made up a word, but you know me, but it amalgamizes politics and a hybrid, a pick and choose of faith, and it fuses them together. And then in the name of faith or religion, you defend that amalgamation. It's a bit of a Frankenstein. It's not Christ-like. It is nationalized Christendom. That's the thing I want to warn all of us about. And I think that goes both ways, right? That's why I kind of say, by the end of this, I was getting into both sides. Like, I was talking a little bit more about who won, because evangelicals are on the side of who won. But both sides equally have to do this thing of being like Jesus to the other side. And both sides have to realize that they don't have a savior in either party, and they'll never have a savior in either party, because they have a savior who's in heaven, who reigns over the earth right now. And we're called to do business his way. We're not called to do business in either the way of the left or the right. And that's my heart in this podcast today. Just to center us on those things and to center us on him. And I think that's going to be needed, because as we move forward, again, I'm not going to be the prophetic voice of here's where I think it's going to go, or here's the warnings that are going to happen. Let the news outlets do all that. I'm saying it doesn't matter, because Christ-likeness is to be played out in every one of those environments, right? Just every one of those environments. And I think that's a harder thing to do. That's the bold thing to do, is to be Christ-like in all these things. And yet I think that's what the world needs to see, right? Because as soon as you think you found your human savior, it's going to rob you, right? And as soon as you think you found your human antichrist and you're going to go to war with that, that's going to rob you. Because again, the way we go to war with all of it is we don't go to war, we go to peace, right? Like, that's the upside down and backwards thing again, right? That's the thing the world needs to see. But I believe if we can own that and we can kind of center ourselves in that we can say, those are my marching orders. The more we can do that, man, the more we will be effective everyday missionaries.